It was a tragedy that should never have happened.
This is the first time that war had really left land and affected the ordinary common man and woman.
Well, there's always been a question of what caused the second explosion.
It must have been very frightening, really.
Century on, it's still felt as a kind of horrific act.
There's great anti-German feeling. Many felt, now this is an enemy that has got to be stopped.
All aboard!
All aboard! Last call now for those going abroad.
All aboard!
These people were ordinary people like ourselves. Some were on board because they thought it was their duty to come back and fight in the war. They all have a different story. More to meet, no more to meet.
All aboard!
If they were going to travel on any ship across the Atlantic, that Lusitania was particularly a safe bet.
Last call now for those going abroad.
Fast, luxurious, and consumed by a century of mystery. The Lusitania was the superliner of her day. But why was she targeted? And why did she sink so quickly?
There was no alternative, basically, from getting to America over to Britain. That was the only option.
It was 1915, and the Lusitania was about to leave New York for Liverpool, a passenger ship supposedly safe from German U-boats.
Up to the sinking of the Lusitania, there hadn't been any passenger liners that had been sunk. There was a threat being made, but many people thought it was an idle threat because the Germans hadn't carried through on any of these threats.
But German U-boat tactics were about to change.
We know perfectly well now that the Germans put advertisements in New York newspapers before the ship left, warning people not to get on the Lusitania, that it was carrying arms, which was strictly against the laws of the sea at that time, and therefore this ship was subject to attack. They got on board that ship and they sailed. They must have been worried, some of them, but they sailed.
It was May the 1st, and for those who boarded, the Lusitania's final journey was about to begin.
They called the Greyhound of the sea, the biggest, fastest ship of her day. For her speed, size and power, 25 knots an hour, she was known as the Greyhound of the sea.
With 2,000 passengers and crew on board, most of the journey was uneventful. But as she neared Ireland, the British Admiralty began issuing U-boat warnings. Passengers were told not to light their cigarettes on deck for fear of being seen by the U-boats.
They did hear the rumours that, they were going to be torpedoed, but the crew weren't afraid because, they didn't believe it. They thought the ship was too fast and too modern and, nothing could catch it, sort of thing.
The following morning, the Admiralty sent this. But it seems what the Lusitania's captain, William Turner, didn't know was that the Admiralty wouldn't or couldn't be more specific because it didn't want to reveal it had broken German naval codes. Turner doubled the lookouts.
There had been thick fog that morning, but by lunchtime that had cleared. It was a lovely spring morning, very still.
Yet another message arrived shortly after. The southeast coast of Ireland was sighted. Turner thought the fog had saved them.
The ship did come closer inland and did change direction, and obviously unbeknownst to them at this point, they were being watched by U-boat U-20.
This is U-20, a German attack submarine. It was captained by Walter Schweiger, an ambitious 30-year-old veteran of submarine warfare. At 9 minutes past 2, he gave the order to fire one torpedo. There's no footage of the actual attack, but what followed was later recreated in this extraordinary 1918 animated film. The torpedo made a huge explosion.
Clear bow shot at 700 meters.
The German U-boat commander Schweiger was watching and made a note in his logbook.
Shot struck starboard side close behind the bridge. An extraordinarily heavy detonation followed, with a very large cloud of smoke.
Billy Burrows was just 15. He was the ship's bellboy.
He was about 3 floors down in the washroom, I believe, and he heard this explosion and all the lights went out.
Robert Leith was the Lusitania's wireless operator.
When the torpedo hit, my grandfather was in the dining room, I think the second class dining room, and immediately went to the wireless operator room and started sending SOS messages.
The ship was going too fast for the crew to launch some lifeboats. And then there was a second explosion. One that's never been fully explained. Fred Russell was a waiter in first class. He later wrote about the chaos.
I helped to lower one boat on the port side. You could do nothing on the starboard, she had such a list, and not fancying staying too long, I beat it down to the lower deck, thinking to chance my luck and jump for it.
Able seaman Joseph Parry was among the crew members who scrambled to rescue passengers.
The lifeboat snagged and didn't end up in the water, but the next thing he was thrown into the water, obviously with the ship tilting. I am told by my mother that one of the people who pulled out the water was a lady who he pulled out by her hair.
The radio operator Robert Leith kept sending SOS messages as water rose above his feet.
The power failed, and there was some sort of emergency backup that he was able to use, and I gather really stayed until the very last minute.
The 15-year-old bellboy, Billy Burrows, made it into a life raft.
So they pulled quite a few people into the boat, even though the boat was full already. And they got to about 50 yards out, and they just did a whoosh, and the ship just upended and sank.
It took just 18 minutes for the Lusitania to go down here, some 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale. Those that managed to get their life jackets on lasted 2 or 3 hours in the water. But those that didn't or couldn't only survived a few minutes in the freezing Atlantic. More than half the 2,000 people on board the Lusitania were killed. There was a rescue operation. The lifeboat crew from Court McSherry rowed from 11 miles away.
It took 3 hours because it was 6 o'clock, you can see.
Rowed for 3 hours.
For 3 hours they reached the site at 6 o'clock, the wreck site.
Michael O'Donovan's great-granduncle Timothy O'Kewen was skipper of the lifeboat. His logbook recalls every detail, but they simply couldn't get there in time.
If they had a bit of wind on the night, they probably would have felt they could have got there sooner and might have been able to save some souls, you know. But I suppose it's a big thing too to be able to even recover bodies, you know, for family's sake, you know.
Survivors who reached shore wandered around Cove and other towns dazed by what had happened. But as Ireland reeled from the tragedy, information filtered back to Britain much more slowly. With no television or radio, it took hours for news of the disaster to reach the Lusitania's home port here in Liverpool. But when the details of the tragedy did emerge, it was met by a combination of anger and revulsion.
I've come here today to see the exhibition.
Liverpool's Maritime Museum has captured the city's stunned reaction, with family accounts from people like David Knowles. His grandfather Joseph Parry was an able seaman on board and helped save many lives.
He saved a lady and her baby, and once in the lifeboat at some stage she was so grateful she gave my grandfather a shoe, one of the shoes of the baby, which he obviously treasured because it came ashore. It was passed down through the family once he was on land again, and he inscribed it underneath with Lusitania 1915, I think the words "lest we forget." So he obviously treasured that, and since then we treasure it as a family.
Fred Russell, the first-class waiter, also survived, and in letters now in the museum he spoke of his relief at escaping and making it back to Liverpool, to the relief of his family.
Uncle Fred came home, but there are a lot of families who probably suffered greatly because they'd lost their income. You know, they'd lost their family member, and they'd probably suffered greatly after that.
But hundreds of other families didn't get good news. Norma Ross's grandfather had been a barkeeper on the ship, but Henry Ross was never found, despite the yearnings of his wife.
He was such an excellent swimmer, according to my grandmother, that she really didn't think, she think if anyone was going to be a survivor, he would, and she was always of the opinion that he may have lost his memory, knock on the head, and could perhaps be somewhere in Ireland, and so people went out to look for him.
And what happened?
Well, he was never found. There was no body found.
Communities on both sides of the Irish Sea went into mourning. Grief that is to this day reenacted by groups like these in Ireland, where they were convulsed by the news. Most simply couldn't believe that a civilian ship had been targeted with such callousness.
We moved into an area of almost kind of total war, where civilian targets were seen as potentially legitimate. It was still a kind of a learning process and a journey into the unknown for the crews and passengers during the First World War.
The small Irish town of Cove struggled to deal with so many dead. The world had never seen civilians attacked like this in war before. A 100 years on, those graves are still tended to, victims of a tragedy that didn't distinguish between age, class, or nationality. More than 120 children died, just over 120 Americans lost their lives, and nearly 200 first-class passengers were killed. In all, just under 1,200 civilians perished on the Lusitania in an act of war. The shock of the Lusitania was felt across Britain and America, which hadn't yet entered the war.
It was overwhelmingly an attack on a civilian ship, and I think those kind of men, women and children that were caught up in that attack, the horror of that is still felt. It was new at the time, but it still has that kind of impact and resonance. A century on, it's still felt as a kind of horrific act.
But within months, Britain was using the sinking in its propaganda war with Germany. The author of War Horse, Michael Morpurgo, touches on this in his new book about the Lusitania.
Well, here's the chest.
His wife Claire's family were among thousands who bought specially made medals issued soon after the disaster.
And there's the medal. And there's the medal where she found it, aged 7.
The medals were exact copies of ones released in Germany, gloating about the tragedy. The British cleverly turned this triumphalist sentiment on its head and issued 300,000 of their own to show the public how barbaric Germany was.
The effect, I think, was clearly worked. For months afterwards, there was great anti-German feeling. Up until that time, this notion that somehow everyone was very happy to go off and join this war. There were plenty of people who were, but there were also plenty of people who were not. Many of those now felt, now this is an enemy that has got to be stopped.
100 years on, the Lusitania now lies in 90 metres of water. A mass of encrusted wreckage. But what's never been fully answered is whether she was a legitimate target. And why did she sink in just 18 minutes? For nearly 50 years, the wreck has been owned by this American businessman, Greg Bemis. Intrigued by the tragedy, he's always wanted answers to those questions, and has spent millions on diving operations to find out. He's now convinced the British government was secretly using passenger liners like the Lusitania to carry munitions for the war effort. And it was these, not the ship's boiler, that caused the second devastating explosion.
There was no question in my mind that there were explosives on board, whether the explosives were gun cotton or whether they were the shrapnel shells, which were supposedly not charged but in fact were. Whatever it was certainly a violent reaction when it went off.
The explosives theory is controversial because there's no clear evidence yet. But Greg Bemis goes further. He says she was also laden with millions of rounds of ammunition, including these bullets. A deadly cargo completely unknown to the passengers.
If the British and American authorities were responsible for putting high explosives on board a passenger ship, I think it should be recorded as such. It shouldn't be left to the imagination of people. It should be yes or no.
Now, a century on, the British Foreign Office has made this limited admission.
Successive British governments have always maintained that there was no munitions on board the Lusitania, and that the Germans were therefore in the wrong to claim to the contrary as an excuse for sinking the ship. The facts are that there is a large amount of ammunition in the wreck.
For increasing numbers of historians, that admission suggests the Lusitania was a legitimate target.
I think there are several people to blame here. The German submarine commander has to take responsibility for the death of 1,200 civilians, but so too must the Admiralty and the British government for introducing civilians into the mix by using civilian vessels for military purposes.
But getting proof of the munitions to the surface has been impossible. One problem is the wreck is disintegrating.
You have the trauma that she experienced at the time of her sinking, the first torpedo, the second explosion. It's like going into a crime scene 100 years later. Can you find that evidence that you were looking for? We don't know, but we have to have a good attempt at trying that.
But there's another problem. Ireland's President, Michael Higgins, is among those who say the wreck should be left untouched as a war grave.
It was, if you like, to assure respect. It also was to enable such investigation to take place in a regulated and responsive environment.
They say it's darkest before the dawn. This thought keeps us moving on.
So for now, the Lusitania must be recalled in other ways.
We should make port before the morning.
In songs and stories passed down through generations.
These early mornings, we should make port.
And for victims and descendants, the once opulent Lusitania has now journeyed into history as a liner shrouded in grief, memories, and secrets.
We will make port before the morning.
It was a tragedy that should never have happened.
She was so affectionately regarded in Liverpool. She was Lucy to the people here.
War now is completely universal in its destruction, and this was in a way the first sign of that. There's been a loss of life like this, other people should always remember.